The streets of Los Angeles were always busy, even late at night. The city buzzed with life, cars speeding by, people walking briskly, lost in their own world. But for some, the sidewalks were more than just a path to another destination. They were home. Clint Eastwood had just finished a quiet dinner at a small tucked-away restaurant in downtown LA. He wasn't one for the flashy Hollywood scene. He preferred low-key places where he could enjoy his meal without much attention. Wearing his usual rugged jacket and a worn-out cap, he blended in with the crowd as he stepped out onto the dimly lit sidewalk. As he walked toward his car, parked a block away, a man sitting on the curb caught his eye. The man's clothes were tattered, his beard unkempt and his eyes filled with exhaustion. He sat with his back against the wall, arms wrapped around himself to keep warm. Clint had seen people like him before. He knew their stories, even if he didn't know their names. Some had lost everything to bad luck, others to bad choices. But whatever the reason, they were still human. As Clint passed by, the man looked up. His voice was hoarse, tired. "Hey, mister, can you spare $1?" Clint paused. He could have kept walking. Many people did. But something about the man's voice made him stop. He reached into his pocket, feeling the familiar weight of his wallet. But instead of pulling out a bill, he crouched down to the man's level. "What's your name?" Clint asked. The man seemed surprised. Most people just tossed a coin and left. They never asked his name. "It's Joe," he said hesitantly. Clint nodded. "Nice to meet you, Joe. Now tell me, what do you really need?" Joe hesitated. I need a few bucks for food." Clint studied him for a moment. The city was full of people who begged for money only to spend it on things that wouldn't help them in the long run. But there was something about Joe, something real. "Come on," Clint said, standing up. "Let's get you something to eat." Joe blinked in confusion. "Wait, really?" Clint simply gestured for him to follow. The two walked a few doors down to a small diner, the kind that stayed open late and served hot meals without the frills. They stepped inside, the warmth of the place instantly cutting through the cold night air. A waitress greeted them with a tired smile. "What can I get you?" Clint nodded toward Joe. "Whatever he wants. It's on me." Joe looked at Clint, then back at the waitress. He hesitated, as if afraid to ask for too much. Maybe just a burger?" Clint raised an eyebrow. "You sure? That's all?" Joe shifted awkwardly. "And some fries. Maybe a coffee?" Clint smirked. "Now we're talking." They sat down at a booth, and for the first time in a long while, Joe felt normal. Not invisible, not ignored. Just a guy having a meal. As they waited, Clint leaned back in his seat. "So what's your story?" Joe sighed. "Lost my job a few years back. Couldn't pay rent. Things spiraled. Once you're out here, it's hard to get back. People don't look at you the same." Clint nodded. He'd seen it before. Life could be unforgiving, and once you were knocked down, getting up again felt impossible. The food arrived, and Joe ate like a man who hadn't had a decent meal in weeks. Clint didn't rush him, didn't say much, just let the man enjoy his food. When Joe finally looked up, his expression was different, softer, grateful. "Why'd you do this?" he asked. Clint shrugged. "Because sometimes people just need a little help. A meal, a conversation, a chance." Joe swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling in. He had asked for $1. Instead, he got something much more valuable. Kindness. Side days. Clint paid the bill and got up to leave. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He placed it on the table in front of Joe. Joe's eyes widened. I can't take this." Clint smirked. "Sure you can, but don't waste it." Joe picked up the bill, his hands shaking. "I won't," he whispered. Clint nodded. "Good. Now do something with it." And with that, Clint Eastwood walked out into the night, disappearing into the city. Joe sat there for a long time, staring at the bill, the empty plate in front of him, and the door Clint had walked through. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost. Hope. Joe sat in the diner long after Clint had left. staring at the $100 bill in his hands. It wasn't just money. It was an opportunity, a challenge even. Clint Eastwood hadn't just handed him cash. He had given him a choice. For the first time in a long time, Joe felt like someone saw him as more than just another homeless man. He wasn't just a face on the street begging for scraps. Clint had looked him in the eye, treated him like a person, and now it was up to him to decide what to do next. He could have walked out and spent the money the way so many others in his situation might have. A bottle, a temporary escape. But something in Clint's voice and his presence made him think twice. Instead of heading back to his usual spot on the sidewalk, Joe walked up to the counter. The waitress, who had been watching the whole thing unfold, raised an eyebrow. "You need anything else, hun?" she asked. Joe hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Do you know of any places that help guys like me? Like, for work?" She looked surprised but smiled. "Yeah, actually. There's a shelter, a few blocks down, Goodwill Mission. They help folks get back on their feet. My cousin got a job through them." Joe took a deep breath. "Thanks. I think I'll check it out." That night, for the first time in a long time, he didn't sleep on the streets. He walked to the shelter, found a bed, and in the morning he used a few of Clint's dollars to clean himself up. He filled out an application for a job program, and within a week he was working small shifts at a warehouse. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Days turned into weeks, and every time Joe thought about quitting, about falling back into the life he had known, he remembered Clint's words, "Now do something with it." Months later, Joe was working full-time, saving money, and even renting a tiny room in a shared apartment. He wasn't rich, he wasn't completely free of struggle, but he was moving forward. One evening, after a long shift, he found himself walking past the same diner where he had met Clint. On impulse, he stepped inside. The same waitress was working, and when she saw him, her eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned," she said with a grin. "Look at you." Joe smiled. He sat down at the counter and placed a $20 bill on the table. "Burger, fries, and a coffee," he said. "And if a guy walks in needing a meal, use the change to cover it." The waitress chuckled, shaking her head. "You sure about that?" Joe nodded. "Yeah, someone did it for me once." As he sat there, sipping his coffee, he wondered if Clint Eastwood even remembered that night. To Clint, it had probably been just another moment in a long life full of them. But to Joe, it had been the moment that changed everything. Months turned into a year. Joe had built a new life, steady work, a modest apartment, and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. But no matter how far he had come, he never forgot the night Clint Eastwood had handed him that $100 bill and a second chance. One evening, after finishing his shift at the warehouse, Joe found himself near the same diner. Something pulled him back. As he stepped inside, the familiar smell of coffee and grilled burgers filled the air. The waitress recognized him immediately and grinned. "Back again?" she asked, pouring him a cup of coffee without even asking. Joe nodded. "Yeah, just felt like stopping by." As he sipped his coffee, his eyes wandered to the door. And then, as if fate had scripted it, Clint Eastwood walked in. Joe froze, his heart pounding. Clint looked exactly the same, calm, confident, that quiet strength radiating from him. He took a seat at a booth, glancing over the menu like he'd never been here before. Joe hesitated, then took a deep breath and stood up. Walking over, he cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood?" Clint looked up, his eyes studying Joe for a moment before recognition flickered in them. He smirked slightly. "Joe, right?" Joe couldn't believe he remembered. He nodded. "Yeah, I wanted to thank you." Clint set down the menu and leaned back. "For what?" Joe smiled, shaking his head. "That night, you didn't just give me $100. You gave me a reason to believe in myself again. I used that money to get back on my feet. Got a job, got a place to stay. I'm not rich, I'm not perfect, but I'm not on the street anymore." Clint studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. You did the work, kid. I just gave you a nudge. Joe laughed. Yeah, well, it was one hell of a nudge. The waitress watching the exchange walked over with a knowing smile. So, Joe, you picking up his tab this time? Joe smirked, reaching for his wallet. Yeah, I think I owe him that much. Clint chuckled but didn't argue. As Joe handed the waitress his card, Clint spoke again. You know, a lot of people get a second chance. Not everyone does something with it. Joe met his gaze and nodded. Well, I figured if Clint Eastwood tells you to do something, you don't. Ignore it. Clint laughed, a deep, genuine laugh. He took a sip of his coffee, then extended his hand. Joe shook it, feeling the strength in Clint's grip. Keep going, Clint said. You've come this far. No reason to stop now. Joe nodded, a wave of gratitude washing over him. I won't. As he walked out of the diner that night, he didn't just feel lucky. He felt ready. Because sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one act of kindness to turn a life around. And thanks to Clint Eastwood, Joe had found his way back. The night air was cool as Joe stepped out of the diner, but he barely noticed. His mind was still replaying the conversation he'd just had. A year ago, he had been sitting on the curb, desperate, hopeless, and barely surviving. Now he had, just shaken hands with the man who had unknowingly saved him. But something about Clint's last words stuck with him. No reason to stop now. Joe had come a long way, but deep down, he knew he wanted more. Working at the warehouse was honest work, but it wasn't his dream. The problem was he wasn't sure what his dream was anymore. He had spent so many years just trying to get by that he'd forgotten what it was like to think about the future, as he walked home. He thought about his past before everything had fallen apart, back when he had a steady job, an apartment, and ambitions. He had always wanted to work with his hands, to build things, to create something lasting. The next morning, as he got ready for work, something felt different. The warehouse had been good to him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant for something else. That day, during his lunch break, Joe made a decision. Instead of scrolling through his phone aimlessly, he searched for trade schools in the area. He found one that offered night classes in carpentry, something he had dabbled in years ago but never pursued seriously. It wasn't easy. Between work and classes, his days were long and exhausting. There were nights when he wanted to quit, when he questioned whether he was too old to start over. But every time doubt crept in, he heard Clint's voice in his head. You've come this far. No reason to stop now. Months passed. Joe's skills improved. He built furniture, repaired homes, and even started taking on small side jobs. The more he worked, the more he realized this was what he was meant to do. One evening, after finishing a job, Joe found himself back at the diner. The same waitress greeted him with a smile. You're looking good, Joe. He grinned. Feeling good, too. As he sat down with his coffee, he heard the door chime behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Clint Eastwood walked in, just like before, casual and composed. He gave Joe a knowing look as he slid into the booth across from him. So, Clint said, what's new? Joe couldn't help but smile. Got myself a trade, carpentry, taking on my own projects now. Clint nodded approvingly. That's good, honest work. Joe leaned forward. You know, I used to think getting off the street was the hard part, but it's what comes after that really matters. You don't just survive. You have to build something. Clint's lips curled into a smirk. Sounds like you finally figured it out. Joe chuckled. Took me long enough. The waitress arrived, setting down 2 coffees. Clint wrapped his hands around his mug, looking thoughtful. Most people think change happens all at once, but it's just a series of small decisions, one after another. Joe nodded. Like giving a guy $100. Clint took a sip of his coffee. Like deciding to use it the right way. Joe sat back, exhaling deeply. He had come full circle, from a man who had nothing to a man who was building something real. Not just a career, but a future. Clint finished his coffee and stood up. Well, kid, I think you'll be just fine. Joe stood too, and this time when he shook Clint's hand, he did so as an equal. "Thanks, Mr. Eastwood, for everything." Clint gave him one last nod before heading for the door. As Joe watched him walk away, he smiled to himself. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. The days that followed felt different for Joe. He woke up each morning with purpose, something he hadn't felt in years. His carpentry business was growing, slowly but steadily. Word had spread about his work, and customers appreciated the craftsmanship he put into every project. One afternoon, as he was sanding down a handmade table in his small rented workshop, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Joe speaking." A deep, familiar voice came through the line. "Still making good use of that $100? Joe's breath caught. "Mr. Eastwood," Clint chuckled on the other end. "You know, kid, I've been thinking about you. I've got a place up in Carmel that could use some work. It's an old ranch-style house, needs some fixing up. Think you can handle it?" Joe nearly dropped the phone. A job for Clint Eastwood? He had gone from begging for $1 to working for the man who had changed his life. I'd be honored," Joe said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Good," Clint said. "Come by next week. Let's see what you can do." The call ended, and Joe stood there for a moment, phone still in hand. A year ago, he was sleeping on the streets. Now, Clint Eastwood was hiring him. The next week, Joe packed up his tools and drove up the California coast to Carmel. The drive was long, but the scenery was beautiful. Rolling hills, ocean views, winding roads that led to Clint's property. When he arrived, Clint was waiting for him. The house was rustic but full of character, nestled among towering trees, with a breathtaking view of the Pacific. Joe whistled. "You undersold it, Mr. Eastwood. This place is incredible." Clint smirked. "Yeah, but it needs a craftsman's touch. That's where you come in." For the next several weeks, Joe worked on the house, restoring the woodwork, repairing the deck, and even building a custom bookshelf for Clint's study. Every night after a long day's work, Clint would sit on the porch with a drink, watching the sunset. Sometimes Joe would join him and they'd talk, not just about work but about life. One evening as they sat on the porch, Clint took a sip of his whiskey and looked over at Joe. "You know," Clint said, "most people in your situation wouldn't have made it out. They would have taken that $100 and wasted it. But you?" He nodded approvingly. "You proved something, to yourself and to the world." Joe looked out at the horizon, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. "I guess I just needed someone to believe in me." Clint smirked. "Nah, you just needed to remember how to believe in yourself." Joe thought about that. He had spent years feeling invisible, lost in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. But Clint was right. That $100 bill wasn't what saved him. It was the choice he made after that. As the last light of the day faded, Joe smiled. He had built more than just furniture and homes. He had rebuilt himself, and this time, he wasn't looking back.